Camp Alva, Oklahoma, July 1943. The mess hall smelled of grease and tobacco, and outside the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees. Inside, 200 German prisoners sat at long wooden tables, their Afrika Korps uniforms faded from desert sun and American laundering. The camp commander had just announced something unprecedented: beer would be served with dinner. Not as punishment, not as bait, simply because the Geneva Convention allowed it, and because someone in Washington had decided that treating prisoners humanely might accomplish what bullets could not. What happened in the following hours would challenge everything these men believed about their captors, their war, and the story they had been told about American weakness. The announcement had come during the afternoon work detail. Major Robert Hastings stood in the center of the compound, flanked by translators, addressing the assembled prisoners with the formal tone military protocol required. He was 42, a career officer from Pennsylvania, who had studied German in college and believed that education created better soldiers than brutality ever could. His face was weathered from 2 years managing POW facilities across the Southwest, and his eyes carried the particular fatigue of men who spent their days maintaining order among the defeated. Beer will be available at evening mess, he told them through Corporal Heinrich Weber, a German-American translator who navigated both languages with equal fluency. The announcement landed without fanfare, delivered as matter of fact as any other administrative detail. 1 bottle per man. American beer, not German. To be consumed in the mess hall under supervision. Any disturbance would result in immediate revocation of the privilege. The prisoners received this information with the wariness of men who had learned not to trust unexpected generosity. Franz Becker sat near the back of the assembly, his hands still dusty from the morning's work on the camp farm. He was 24, a sergeant captured at Kasserine Pass after his unit's supply lines collapsed and resistance became mathematically futile. Before the war, he had worked in his father's brewery outside Munich, learning the craft of fermentation and aging, understanding beer the way some men understood machinery or music. The regime's expansion had interrupted that education, replacing it with tank maneuvers and desert warfare, and finally the strange limbo of captivity. American beer, Franz thought, and felt something close to contempt. He had heard about American beer from veterans of the previous war: thin, tasteless, more like carbonated water than proper lager. The regime's propaganda had reinforced this assessment, using American beer as metaphor for American culture itself. Weak, commercial, lacking the depth and tradition that made German civilization superior. Beer was supposed to reflect national character, and if American beer was as poor as reported, what did that suggest about the nation that produced it? The afternoon work continued. The prisoners tended crops in fields that stretched toward the horizon, corn and wheat growing in Oklahoma soil that felt nothing like the European earth most of them remembered. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and sweat soaked through their uniforms before noon. Some prisoners had been here since the camp opened in April. Others had arrived more recently, fresh from interrogation centers on the East Coast, still adjusting to captivity's rhythms and regulations. Klaus Zimmermann worked the row next to Franz, his face sunburned despite the wide-brimmed hat guards it issued. He was 19, captured at Tunis during the final collapse, and his letters home maintained elaborate fictions about his circumstances. He wrote of adequate food and fair treatment, but framed everything carefully, aware that censors read every word, and that his family remained in Germany, where truthful accounts of American decency might be interpreted as weakness or betrayal. "You think they're serious about the beer?" Klaus asked during a water break, wiping his forehead with a dusty sleeve. Franz shrugged. "The Geneva Convention allows it. Some camps serve beer regularly. Others never do. Depends on the commander. What's American beer like?" Franz had never tasted it, but he repeated what he'd been told. Like drinking the water they use to wash the bottles. No body, no proper fermentation. They rush everything, mass-produce everything. No craft, no tradition. Klaus nodded, accepting this assessment without question. The regime's teachings had been comprehensive on the subject of American inferiority. Their culture was shallow, their values materialistic, their strength an illusion built on industrial production rather than genuine superiority. Beer was simply one more example in a long catalog of American inadequacy. The work detail ended at 4. The prisoners returned to their barracks to wash away the dust and sweat, using cold water from spigots that ran continuously. The barracks were simple wooden structures, hot in summer and cold in winter, lined with double-decker bunks and metal lockers where men kept their few possessions. Photographs from home, letters, books, the occasional trinket acquired through trade with guards or other prisoners. Franz kept a small notebook where he recorded recipes and brewing techniques, maintaining connection with the craft he hoped to return to when the war ended and prisoners were repatriated. Evening mess began at 6. The prisoners filed into the dining hall in orderly lines, habits of military discipline persisting despite the absence of officers and formal chain of command. The mess hall could accommodate 300 men, with long tables arranged in rows and a serving line where American cooks dispensed food onto metal trays. The menu that evening was standard meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, coffee. And at the end of the line, unexpected and somehow surreal, cases of bottled beer stacked on folding tables, condensation beating on the glass. The beer was Budweiser. Franz recognized the label from propaganda posters that had mocked American commercial brewing. Each bottle held 12 ounces, and each prisoner received exactly 1. The bottles were already opened, caps removed by guards using wall-mounted openers. No glass containers would leave the mess hall, another security precaution in a facility designed to prevent escapes and violence while maintaining humane conditions. Franz collected his tray and bottle, then found a seat at one of the long tables. Klaus sat across from him, and around them other prisoners settled into their places with the quiet efficiency of men who had performed this routine hundreds of times. Conversation hummed through the hall in German, a language the guards understood in fragments, but allowed because suppressing it would accomplish nothing except resentment. The beer sat untouched while men ate. Some prisoners regarded it with curiosity, others with skepticism. A few seemed embarrassed by it, accepting beer from captors felt like collaboration somehow, a blurring of the clear lines that should exist between prisoner and guard, enemy and enemy. But the Geneva Convention entitled them to this, and refusing it seemed equally problematic, a rejection of rights that international law guaranteed. Franz finished his meatloaf and potatoes, then lifted the bottle. The glass was cold against his palm, and moisture transferred to his skin. He examined the label with professional interest. Budweiser, brewed in St. Louis, Missouri. An industrial product, mass-produced in quantities German breweries couldn't imagine. He thought about his father's brewery, where each batch was monitored with obsessive attention, where tradition dictated every step of the process, where rushing meant failure. He raised the bottle to his lips and drank. The first impression was temperature. Cold, almost shockingly cold compared to the German tradition of serving beer, only slightly chilled. The second impression was carbonation high, aggressive, the bubbles sharp against his tongue. And then the taste arrived, and Franz's expectations collided with reality in a way that left him momentarily disoriented. It was not what he had anticipated, not thin or watery or flavorless. It was light, yes, lighter than Munich lager, lacking the heavy malt character German brewing emphasized. But it was clean, remarkably clean. The flavors were delicate rather than robust, the bitterness restrained, the finish quick and refreshing. In Oklahoma's 100-degree heat, after 9 hours of field work, this beer was not a disappointment. It was exactly what the moment required. Franz set the bottle down, processing what he had just experienced. Around him, other prisoners were drinking, and he watched their reactions. Klaus made a face initially, clearly expecting something worse, and took another sip with visible reassessment. Werner Schultz, a corporal from Hamburg who had worked in a chemical plant before conscription, drank deeply and reached the same conclusion Franz had. "It's not bad," Werner said quietly, his voice carrying surprise bordering on confusion. "It's actually good. Different, but good." The admission felt dangerous somehow. Acknowledging that American beer was drinkable meant acknowledging that propaganda had lied about this detail. And if propaganda lied about beer, what else might it have misrepresented? The question hovered unspoken, but Franz felt it nonetheless. Small cracks in certainty, propagating through foundations that had seemed solid until tested. The mess hall filled with similar realizations. Conversations shifted from German to English and back as prisoners compared impressions, debated characteristics, tried to reconcile expectation with experience. Some insisted the beer was inferior, despite evidence to the contrary, clinging to familiar narratives. Others admitted confusion. They had been told American beer was undrinkable, yet here was proof otherwise. A few simply enjoyed the moment without analysis, grateful for any pleasure captivity offered. Major Hastings observed from the entrance. Standing beside Corporal Weber, the two men watched the prisoners' reactions with interest that bordered on academic. They seemed surprised. Weber noted. Hastings nodded. They were told American beer is terrible. Part of the larger narrative about American weakness and inferiority. When reality contradicts that narrative, cognitive dissonance results. You think one bottle of beer can change minds? Not change, exactly, but create doubt. Make them question what else they've been told. It's a small thing, but small things accumulate. Weber was silent for a moment, watching Franz set his empty bottle on the table with careful precision. "I fled Germany in '38, sir. My family saw what was coming. But I remember the certainty everyone had that the regime's version of reality was truth itself. Breaking that certainty requires more than arguments. It requires experiences that cannot be explained away." The beer service became routine over following weeks. Every Wednesday and Saturday, bottles appeared at evening mess. The prisoners stopped treating it as a surprise and began anticipating it as privilege earned. Some men savored their single bottle slowly, making it last through the entire meal. Others drank quickly, chasing the brief pleasant fog that one beer could provide. A few prisoners attempted to trade other items for additional bottles, but guards enforced the one per man limit strictly. Franz found himself thinking about beer in new ways. His father's brewery had operated on principles that seemed absolute. Proper fermentation required specific conditions. Aging could not be rushed. Tradition must be honored. But American brewing operated under different constraints. They needed to produce enormous quantities, needed beer that could travel long distances, needed flavor profiles that appealed to mass markets rather than regional preferences. The result was different, not inferior. Just different. This recognition bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The regime's teachings had emphasized absolute German superiority, American weakness, the inevitable triumph of German civilization over decadent democratic culture. Beer was supposed to exemplify this hierarchy. German beer was real beer, proper beer, while American beer was weak imitation. But Franz could not sustain that judgment after repeated experience contradicted it. Klaus noticed the shift during their next work detail. "You've been quiet lately," he observed while they harvested tomatoes from the camp garden. "Something wrong?" Franz considered how to articulate what he was thinking. "The beer," he said finally. "It's not what we were told." Klaus glanced around, ensuring no guards were close enough to overhear. "So? Propaganda lies about everything. Why should beer be different?" Because if they lied about something as simple as beer, what else did they lie about? The question hung between them like smoke. Klaus returned to the tomatoes, his movements mechanical. "Franz," he said quietly, Don't start questioning everything. It doesn't help. We're prisoners." The war continues whether we believe in it or not. Our families are still in Germany. We'll return eventually. What purpose does doubt serve? Franz had no answer. Klaus was right that doubt served no practical purpose. But doubt existed regardless of utility, growing in the space between what he had been taught and what he experienced daily. The beer was simply the most recent example in a series of contradictions that had accumulated since capture. The guards at Camp Alva treated prisoners firmly, but without cruelty. The food was adequate, sometimes generous. Medical care was provided without hesitation. Work assignments were demanding, but not punishing. Letters from home arrived regularly, censored but not withheld. The camp library stocked German books alongside English ones. None of this matched the descriptions of American prisoner treatment. The regime had disseminated stories of starvation, torture, forced labor that bordered on slavery. August arrived with continued heat. The prisoners adapted, working early mornings and late afternoons to avoid midday sun. The beer on Wednesday and Saturday evenings became anticipated relief, something cold and pleasant in a life otherwise defined by routine and restriction. Franz noticed that even prisoners who initially claimed to hate American beer now drank their bottles without complaint. One Saturday evening, a new prisoner arrived at Franz's table. Hauptmann Otto Richter had been captured in Sicily during the invasion and only recently processed through the interrogation system. He was older than most prisoners, 45, with gray threading through his hair and the bearing of a career officer who had seen combat in the previous war. He sat down with his tray and beer, surveying the mess hall with the careful attention of someone assessing new circumstances. Franz introduced himself and Klaus, following the informal protocol that governed prisoner interactions. Richter nodded acknowledgement, then examined his beer bottle with visible distaste. "American beer," he said flatly. "Deplorable. Have you tried it?" Franz asked. "I don't need to. I know what American beer is like. Thin, tasteless, carbonated dishwater." The regime's analysis was quite specific on this point. Franz said nothing, watching as Richter left the bottle untouched through the entire meal. Around them, other prisoners drank without comment, and Franz saw Richter notice this, saw the slight confusion that crossed his face as he processed the disconnect between his expectations and observed reality. After dinner, as prisoners filed out of the mess hall, Richter approached Franz again. "The others drink it," he observed, his tone uncertain. "It's not bad," Franz replied. "Different from German beer, but well made for what it is." Richter frowned. "You sound like you've developed a taste for enemy beer." "I've developed an appreciation for quality, brewing regardless of nationality. There's a difference." The conversation ended there, but Franz saw Richter at the next beer service. This time the Hauptmann drank, and Franz watched the same progression of surprise and reassessment play across his face that had become familiar from dozens of other prisoners. Expectation, contradiction, confusion, grudging acknowledgement. The sequence varied in duration, but not in substance. By September, Richter had become a regular presence at Franz's table. The Hauptmann rarely spoke during meals, but his silence carried thoughtfulness rather than hostility. One evening, after finishing his beer, he turned to Franz with a question. "Your father owned a brewery, you said?" Franz nodded. "Outside Munich. Nothing large, but we had a good reputation locally." "And you know American brewing methods?" "Only what I've observed from drinking their product. But yes, I understand generally how they approach fermentation and production." Richter was quiet for a long moment. Then, "If German beer is superior, as we were taught, why does American beer accomplish its purpose so effectively? Why do I find myself looking forward to Wednesday and Saturday evenings?" Franz had been asking himself the same question for months. "Because superiority is an absolute," he said slowly. "It depends on context, on what you're trying to achieve. German brewing optimizes for flavor complexity and tradition. American brewing optimizes for mass production and broad appeal. Neither is wrong. They're just different approaches to the same basic craft. The regime's position was that German methods were the only legitimate methods, that American industrialization of brewing represented cultural decay. The regime's position was wrong about many things, Franz said, and immediately regretted the words. But they were spoken, and Richter didn't react with outrage. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if Franz had simply confirmed something he had already concluded privately. The conversation marked a subtle shift in the camp atmosphere. Prisoners began speaking more openly about contradictions between propaganda and experience. Not in public forums where such discussions might attract attention, but in quiet conversations during work details or evening hours. The beer became symbolic concrete evidence that official narratives could be questioned, that reality sometimes contradicted authority, that skepticism might be warranted. Major Hastings noticed the change during his regular tours of the compound. The prisoners seemed less rigid, less bound by the ideological certainty that had characterized their early months of captivity. They worked as diligently as before, followed regulations as carefully, but something had loosened in their collective posture. Corporal Weber confirmed Hastings' observation during one of their meetings. "They're questioning things," Weber reported. "Not openly, but in private conversations. The beer service has become a focal point for those questions. Is that problematic?" Hastings considered. On the contrary, men who question propaganda are less likely to remain committed to the ideology that produced it. Our goal isn't to convert them to American democracy. It is simply to undermine their certainty that German totalitarianism represents the only legitimate worldview. The beer is accomplishing that more effectively than any direct political instruction could. "It's strange," Weber said. "Something as simple as beer, causing such fundamental reassessment. Not strange at all. Grand ideologies are difficult to challenge directly, but small, concrete experiences accumulate. Each one creates a tiny crack in the structure. Eventually, the structure becomes unstable." October brought cooler weather. The prisoners worked outdoors without the oppressive heat, and the camp took on a more settled character as men adjusted to the likelihood that they would remain here for the war has duration. Franz continued his brewing notes, now including observations about American techniques and how they differed from German traditions. He had begun thinking about post-war possibilities, how his father's brewery might adapt certain American innovations while maintaining German quality standards. Klaus noticed the notebook one evening and asked to see it. Franz handed it over, watching his young friend page through entries that documented everything from hop varieties to fermentation temperatures to marketing strategies. "You're planning for after," Klaus observed. "Someone has to. Germany will need rebuilding when this ends. Businesses will need to restart. Why not prepare now? You think we'll return to normal lives? After everything?" Franz thought about this question often. "I think we'll return to lives. Whether they're normal depends on how we approach them. The regime will fall eventually. Anyone paying attention can see that. What comes after is what matters." Klaus handed back the notebook. "You've changed since we arrived here. You used to be certain about things." "I was certain about what I'd been told. Experience has complicated that certainty. Is that better or worse?" Franz didn't have an answer. Better in the long term, perhaps. More uncomfortable in the short term. Certainty was comforting, even when it was wrong. Doubt required constant reassessment, constant willingness to question assumptions. But doubt also allowed growth, allowed learning, allowed the possibility that the world might be more complex than propaganda suggested. The beer services continued through fall and into winter. By December, Camp Alva had received over 2,000 prisoners, and the Wednesday-Saturday routine had become institution. New arrivals quickly learned the pattern work: meals, occasional mail, and beer twice weekly. Some newcomers clung to propaganda narratives about American beer being undrinkable, but reality eroded those convictions within weeks. Franz found himself serving as informal advisor to prisoners interested in brewing. His professional background made him a resource, and men would approach him with questions about fermentation, about techniques, about whether American methods might be applied in Germany after the war. These conversations felt subversive in ways that had nothing to do with politics. They suggested acceptance that some American practices might be worth adopting, that cultural exchange might enrich rather than contaminate German traditions. Christmas arrived with unexpected generosity. The camp administration organized a celebration that included additional food, decorations made by prisoners in the craft shop, and a special beer service that provided 2 bottles per man instead of the usual one. Franz sat with Klaus, Richter, and several others, drinking slowly and talking about Christmas memories from before the war. My father always said, Christmas revealed a brewery's true character, Franz said, holding his second bottle up to the light. We would release a special winter lager, darker and stronger than our summer offerings. It took months to prepare properly, couldn't be rushed. Do you think American breweries do anything similar? Klaus asked. Franz nodded. I'm certain they do. Not the same methods, but similar concepts. Every brewing culture develops seasonal variations. The specifics differ, but the underlying understanding is universal beer should complement the season, the food, the mood. Richter listened quietly, then spoke. 6 months ago, I would have dismissed that statement as relativism. Now I'm not certain why I would have objected. The comment drew nods from others at the table. The war had changed them in ways that had nothing to do with combat or military outcome. It had forced recognition that certainty was often illusion, that cultural superiority was propaganda rather than fact, that human practices across different societies reflected common needs approached through different methods. The evening stretched late, longer than usual mess hall hours. Guards allowed it because Christmas warranted exception, and because prisoners had demonstrated over months that they could be trusted with small privileges. Franz finished his second beer and felt the pleasant warmth that came from alcohol and company, and the temporary suspension of a fight. Captivity as routine restrictions. Later, walking back to the barracks through December cold, Klaus spoke quietly. Do you think the regime understood what they were doing when they taught us to despise American beer? Franz considered the question. I think they understood symbols better. Beer represents culture, tradition, national character. If they could convince us American beer was worthless, we would generalize that judgment to American culture as a whole. But the strategy failed. The strategy failed because it depended on us never experiencing American beer directly. Propaganda works until reality intervenes. Then it collapses, and the collapse extends beyond this specific lie to the entire system of lies. They walked in silence, breath visible in the cold air. Above them, stars spread across an Oklahoma sky that looked nothing like European stars, but followed the same celestial patterns, regardless of geography or ideology. Franz thought about his father's brewery, about the craft he had learned before war interrupted everything, about the future that seemed both distant and somehow inevitable. The war would end eventually. Prisoners would be repatriated. Life would resume in whatever form remained possible after years of destruction. And Franz would return to brewing, carrying with him knowledge that had nothing to do with military service or combat experience. He would remember American beer, remember the moment when propaganda dissolved against reality, remember that cultural exchange could enrich rather than threaten. 1944 arrived without ceremony. The camp population continued growing as Allied advances in Europe and the Pacific produced steady streams of captured German soldiers. The beer services persisted through winter's cold, and prisoners continued their twice-weekly ritual of drinking Budweiser while discussing everything except the war's obvious trajectory. Franz noticed that newer prisoners adapted faster than earlier arrivals. The camp had developed its own culture by now, a hybrid of German military discipline and American pragmatism, and newcomers absorbed this culture more readily than they absorbed propaganda they had brought with them. The beer became initiation of sorts, a test of willingness to experience reality rather than clinging to preconceptions. By spring, Franz had filled 3 notebooks with brewing observations and plans. He wrote letters to his father, describing American techniques without explicit endorsement, trusting that his father would understand the subtext. The censors read everything, but allowed technical brewing discussion, apparently concluding that fermentation methods posed no security risk. Major Hastings rotated out in April, replaced by a younger officer who maintained the same policies. The beer services continued. The camp routine continued. The war continued, though news from Europe suggested its end approached inevitably. Franz marked time through the change of seasons, through the accumulation of small experiences that reshaped his understanding more effectively than any direct challenge to propaganda could have. Years later, after repatriation and reconstruction and the slow process of rebuilding ordinary life, Franz would think about Camp Alva with complicated emotions. Captivity had been restriction, boredom, separation from family and homeland. But it had also been education of a kind no classroom could provide. He had learned that certainty was often illusion, that propaganda dissolved against experience, that cultural superiority was myth rather than reality. And he had learned these lessons through beer, through the simple act of drinking Budweiser on Wednesday and Saturday evenings, comparing it against expectations, discovering that reality was more complex than propaganda suggested. The regime had taught him that American beer was weak, that American culture was decadent, that German superiority was absolute and unchallengeable. But the regime had never anticipated that prisoners would actually taste American beer, would make their own judgments based on direct experience rather than accepted narrative. That was propaganda's fundamental flaw. It required isolation from contradictory evidence. Once prisoners experienced reality directly, propaganda lost its power. One beer at a time, twice weekly, accumulating over months and years, the official narrative crumbled. And when it crumbled regarding beer, it crumbled regarding everything else. If they had lied about something as verifiable as beer, what else had they lied about? The question, once asked, could not be unasked. Franz reopened his father's brewery in 1948. The building had survived the war, damaged but repairable, and they spent a year rebuilding equipment and re-establishing supply chains. When production finally resumed, Franz introduced changes his father initially resisted. Faster fermentation schedules adapted from American methods. Marketing approaches borrowed from commercial brewing. Product lines designed for broader appeal beyond regional preferences. His father objected, arguing that these innovations compromised tradition. Franz countered that tradition was valuable but not sacred, that survival in post-war Germany required adaptation, that stubbornly clinging to the old ways would lead only to irrelevance. Eventually, his father asked where these ideas came from. Franz told him about Camp Alva, about the Wednesday and Saturday beer services, about learning to appreciate American brewing despite years of propaganda insisting it was worthless. His father listened without interruption, and when Franz finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment. "You learned this from captivity?" Franz nodded. "I learned that our certainty about German superiority was propaganda, that other cultures approach brewing differently, but not worse, that tradition and innovation can coexist if you're willing to question assumptions." His father considered this, then asked the question Franz had anticipated. If they lied about beer, what else did they lie about? Everything, Franz said simply. They lied about everything. The brewery survived and eventually prospered. Franz introduced his innovations gradually, maintaining German quality standards while incorporating American efficiency and marketing. The combination proved effective, and within a decade, they had expanded beyond their regional market into national distribution. Franz never forgot the origin of these ideas, the mess hall at Camp Alva, the cold bottles of Budweiser, The moment when reality contradicted propaganda so definitively that his entire worldview shifted. He kept one of his notebooks from captivity, the pages filled with brewing observations and plans. Sometimes he would page through it, remembering the specific taste of American beer in Oklahoma heat, remembering Klaus and Richter and the hundreds of other prisoners who had undergone the same transformation. They had expected cruelty and found routine decency. They had expected terrible beer and found good beer. They had expected confirmation of propaganda and found contradiction instead. And that contradiction had accomplished what Allied bombs and military defeats could not. It had undermined the certainty that made totalitarian ideology possible. One small crack at a time, each beer service widening the fissures until the entire structure of propaganda collapsed under the weight of accumulated contradictions. Franz died in 1982, his brewery successful and his children carrying on the work he had rebuilt from ruins. At his funeral, Klaus spoke. He had survived the war, returned to Germany, maintained contact with Franz across 4 decades. He told the story of Camp Alva, of the beer services, of the moment when 2 young prisoners realized propaganda had lied about something as simple and verifiable as beer. "It seems insignificant," Klaus said, addressing the assembled mourners. 1 bottle of beer, twice weekly, in an Oklahoma prisoner of war camp. But those bottles changed everything. They taught us that certainty was illusion, that propaganda dissolved against reality, that direct experience mattered more than official narrative. Franz carried that lesson forward into everything he did afterward. And this brewery, he gestured at the building where they had gathered, stands as testament to what happens when you refuse propaganda and embrace reality instead. The bottles of Budweiser consumed at Camp Alva between 1943 and 1945 numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Each one was drunk and forgotten, a small moment in a larger story of captivity and war. But collectively, they represented something more significant than any single bottle could suggest. They represented the dissolution of certainty, the collapse of propaganda, the power of direct experience to contradict official narrative. And they proved that sometimes the most effective weapons against totalitarian ideology aren't arguments or bombs or political speeches. Sometimes they're simply reality presented clearly enough that lies cannot survive exposure. A cold bottle of beer, drunk in Oklahoma heat, by prisoners who expected something terrible and found something good. That contradiction, repeated twice weekly for years, accomplished what more dramatic interventions could not. It taught them to question everything. And once you begin questioning, certainty becomes impossible to maintain.